My name is Vesper, and I'm 32 years old. 7 years ago, my mother stood in our hallway on Potomac Street and told me I was a thief who had stolen the only legacy she had left. She watched as I walked into a St. Louis rainstorm in 26-degree weather with nothing but a forest green Columbia backpack and a silence so heavy I thought it would snap my spine. I spent that first night shivering in a 24-hour laundromat, clutching $42 and a nursing textbook while my brother slept in my bed and my mother bolted the door. 7 years later, she found me. Not through a letter of apology, but through the double doors of a Level 1 trauma center. She didn't come to find her daughter. She came to find a miracle for her golden son. What she got instead was a clinical correction of a 7-year-old lie. A piece of evidence so undeniable that it made her drop her designer purse and realize she had sacrificed her protector for a predator. Before I continue, if this story of justice resonates with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with it. I'd love to know where you're watching from right now and what time it is. Drop it in the comments below. Now, let me take you back to the night the sirens brought my past back to life. The night shift has a specific rhythm, a hum of HVAC systems and the rhythmic beep of monitors that sounds like a mechanical heart. At 2:14 a.m., that rhythm was shattered. The radio on the wall crackled with a high-priority dispatch. Trauma Level 1, high-speed collision on I-64. Multiple casualties. ETA 3 minutes. I didn't rush. Rushing leads to mistakes. Instead, I felt a familiar snap of nitrile gloves as I pulled them over my fingers. A sharp, clinical sound that signaled the start of order. I felt the weight of my trauma shears in my scrub pocket and adjusted my stethoscope. My pulse was a steady 60 beats per minute. I've learned that in chaos, the person with the lowest heart rate wins. Someone once said that the ultimate test of character is not where you stand in moments of comfort, but where you stand in times of challenge. I prefer my own version. Character is what remains when everything you thought defined you has been stripped away. The double doors burst open. The sound of sirens bled into the hallway, a mournful, piercing wail that usually triggers a surge of adrenaline. But as the first gurney was wheeled in, the air in the room seemed to vanish. The man on the gurney was unrecognizable at first, covered in road rash, glass shards, and the dark, wet crimson of an uncontrolled bleed. But then I saw it. On the side of his neck, just below the jawline, was a birthmark shaped like a jagged crescent moon. It was Cyprian, my brother. The man who had looked me in the eyes 7 years ago and lied to our mother, claiming I had stolen her legacy, just to cover his own gambling debts. The man who watched from the window as I walked into a St. Louis rainstorm at 19 with nothing but a backpack and a silence so heavy it nearly crushed my ribs. As the team moved in a choreographed swarm around him, my personal phone, a device that hadn't received a call from anyone sharing my blood in nearly a decade, vibrated violently in my pocket. I stepped back, my eyes never leaving the birthmark on the gurney, and pulled it out. The caller ID simply said, "Mom." I answered. I didn't say hello. I just listened to the sound of my own breathing. "Vesper? I know you're there." Leona's voice came through, frantic and sharp, cutting through the hospital noise like a blade. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask where I had been for 7 years or how I had survived the night she threw me out in 26-degree weather. "I tracked the ambulance. Cyprian is coming to your hospital. You're in charge there, aren't you? You save him, Vesper. Do you hear me? He is all I have left. Don't you dare let your bitterness get in the way. He is your brother. He is the only hope of this family." I felt the heat of a phantom slap on my cheek from 7 years ago. I felt the weight of that Columbia backpack on my shoulders, the straps digging into my skin as I realized my mother wasn't calling to reconcile. She was calling to use me. To her, I wasn't a daughter who had achieved success against all odds. I was a utility, a tool to be picked up when her golden sun was broken and put back in the drawer when the job was done. My face burned, a slow, deep heat that reached my teeth, but I didn't yell. I didn't remind her that I had been the one sleeping in bus stations while Cyprian spent her retirement money. I just looked at the digital clock on the wall. 2:19. "I will do my job," I said. My voice was a flatline, devoid of the emotion she was trying to harvest. "Vesper, listen to me." I didn't wait for her to finish. I pressed the red button and the screen went black with a soft, final click. I looked at the phone for 3 seconds, then I slipped it back into my pocket. I felt the fabric of my scrubs against my skin. High quality, professional, earned. This was the only thing I truly owned. This was the identity I had built while they were busy erasing me. I stepped back toward the gurney where the doctors were shouting for a chest tube. I was his only hope, but not for the reasons my mother thought. I wasn't saving a brother, I was treating a patient. And for the first time in 7 years, I realized that the silence I had carried out of that house wasn't a burden. It was an armor. I reached out and took the clipboard from the resident. My hands were steady. My pulse hadn't moved. I had spent my life being told I was the problem, the thief, the failure. But standing there, under the harsh white lights of the trauma bay, I knew the truth. I am not the person they left in the rain, and I am no longer waiting for them to notice. To understand the silence of the trauma bay in St. Louis, you have to understand the silence of the brick house on Potomac Street where I grew up. It was a house built on Midwestern stoicism and a very specific kind of math. In our family, there was a sun and there was a moon. My brother Cyprian was the sun. Everything in the house, the heat, the schedule, my mother's attention, rotated around him. I was the moon, visible only when it was convenient, and usually only there to reflect a light that didn't belong to me. I remember the liturgy of our dinner table. It's funny the things you remember when you're 32. Not the big fights, but the way a fork scrapes against a ceramic plate. My mother, Leona, would serve pot roast on Sunday evenings. The kitchen would be thick with the smell of slow-cooked beef and carrots. She would lift the lid, the steam clouding her glasses, and the first slice, the center cut, the most tender, would always find its way to Cyprian's plate. She didn't have to think about it. It was a reflex, as natural as breathing. "You need your strength, Cyprian," she'd say, her voice softening in a way she only reserved for him. "You've been working so hard on the team." Cyprian would nod, his mouth already full, his birthmark on his neck pulsing as he chewed. He was 21 then, 3 years older than me, but he lived in a state of perpetual adolescence that my mother nurtured like a prize-winning orchid. I would sit across from him, waiting. By the time the platter reached me, the roast was mostly fat and gristle. I'd clear the table before I was even finished with my own meal, because that was my role. I was the utility child. I was the one who refilled the water glasses, the one who remembered to buy the milk, the one who balanced the household checkbook when Leona's eyes got too tired. I wasn't a victim, I was a volunteer. I truly believed that by being the person who never complained, the person who made everything run smoothly, I was earning a seat at a table that was already mine. Someone once said that the price of greatness is responsibility. In our house, the price of my brother's potential was my invisibility. I remember a Tuesday in my freshman year of nursing school. I had worked 30 hours that week at the bakery, on top of 18 credit hours. I brought home a letter from the dean's office. I had made the dean's list with a 4.0 GPA. I placed the letter on the granite countertop where Leona was folding laundry. "Mom, look," I said, my voice quiet but holding a rare spark of hope. She glanced at it, her hands never stopping their rhythmic folding of Cyprian's soccer jerseys. "That's good, Vesper. Put it on the pile with the mail." 5 minutes later, the garage door groaned open. Cyprian walked in, cursing about a scratch on his truck. Leona dropped the laundry instantly. She rushed to him, her face radiant with a frantic kind of care. "Oh, honey, let me see. Don't worry, we'll find the money to fix it. You shouldn't have to drive around with a dented ego." I watched them from the hallway. I didn't feel rage. I felt a cold, logical clarity. I rationalized it. I told myself that because I was strong, I didn't need the praise. I told myself that Cyprian was sensitive, and because he was prone to mistakes, he needed more of her. I convinced myself that love was a limited resource, and if I took any for myself, there wouldn't be enough left to keep him from falling apart. I thought I was being noble. I didn't realize I was just being erased. The moment the math of our house became permanent happened on a Thursday night in October. I was 19. I was sitting at my desk, the light of my small lamp illuminating a thick textbook on anatomy. I had a final exam the next morning. The door opened without a knock. It was Leona. "Vesper, turn that off," she whispered. "Cyprian has a migraine. The light under your door is bothering him." "Mom, I have a final tomorrow. It's the only lamp in the room." "He needs to rest, Vesper. You're smart. You can figure it out. You've always been the one who could handle things." She didn't wait for an answer. She reached over and clicked the switch. The room plunged into a darkness so thick I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I gathered my books and my highlighter and sat on the cold floorboards of the hallway, leaning against the baseboard. I studied under the dim yellow glow of the low-wattage hallway bulb, the one that flickered every time the refrigerator kicked on. I sat there for 4 hours. My back ached, and my fingers were stiff from the draft coming through the floor, but I didn't move. I looked at the shadow I cast against the wall, a long, distorted shape that didn't look like a girl at all. It looked like a machine. I realized then that my existence in that house was permitted only as long as it didn't cast a shadow on Cyprian. I was the lubricant that kept their world from grinding to a halt, but I was never meant to be a part of the engine itself. It was a strange, hollow feeling. I looked at the closed door of my mother's room, and then at the closed door of my brother's room. I was the only one awake, the only one guarding the silence they required. I felt a vague, haunting sensation in the pit of my stomach. Not a thought, just a vibration. I wonder if the position I've worked so hard to reach is the grave I'm digging for myself. I didn't call it betrayal yet. I just called it home. By the time I was 21, my role in the family had solidified into something structural. I wasn't just a daughter or a sister anymore. I was a contingency plan. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being the person who can always figure it out. It's a quiet, heavy fatigue that settles into your bones like Missouri humidity. But back then, I didn't call it exhaustion. I called it being reliable. I called it love. I was working 35 hours a week at a local bakery in South City while finishing my clinical rotations. The air there was always thick with the smell of yeast and burnt sugar, a scent that stayed in my hair even after 2 showers. I kept a glass jar under my bed. Inside were crinkled $5 bills and rolls of quarters, my tuition fund, my escape from Potomac Street fund. I guarded that jar like it was my own heartbeat. Then came the morning the blue-white glare of the St. Louis County jailhouse waiting room became part of my history. It was 4:15 a.m. when Leona called. "Vesper, honey, I need you. Cyprian. He made a mistake, just a small one, but the police, they're being so difficult." It wasn't a small mistake, it was a DUI. He had clipped a parked car and blown twice the legal limit. When I arrived at the station, my mother was sitting on a plastic chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Cyprian was in a holding cell, probably sleeping off the bourbon. "The bail is $1,200, Vesper," she said, not looking at me. "And the impound fees? I don't have it. My mortgage payment went out yesterday." I stood there, the smell of the bakery still clinging to my skin, thinking about the glass jar under my bed. $1,200 was exactly 3 months of standing on my feet until my calves burned. "Mom, that's my tuition money. I have to pay the bursar by Friday." "Oh, Vesper," she sighed, finally looking up. Her eyes were wet, but her voice held that familiar, ironclad expectation. "You're strong. You've always been the rock. You can pick up extra shifts, but Cyprian, if this stays on his record, he'll never get that management job he's been talking about. He's so sensitive, Vesper. This will break him. You? You can handle a few more weeks of hard work. It's for the family. We help each other." That was the phrase. We help each other. But in our house, the we was a one-way street. I drove home, pulled the jar from under the bed, and felt the weight of those months of labor disappear into an envelope. I didn't argue. I didn't even cry. I just thought, I'm the one who can handle it. That's who I am. Over the next 2 years, the just this once requests became a weekly rhythm. The architecture of my life was built on the necessity of others. When Cyprian forgot to pay the electric bill because he'd bought new rims for his truck, I was the one who called Amerin and paid the arrears. When the Wi-Fi was cut off because he was too busy gaming to remember the due date, my credit card was the one on file. At Sunday dinners with the extended family, Leona would beam at the table. "Vesper is doing so well. she'd tell Aunt Margaret. She's so independent. She's our rock. She doesn't need a dime from anyone. Then she would lower her voice and look at Cyprian. But poor Cyprian, the economy is just so hard on him. He's struggling. He needs us right now. I sat there, eating the fat and gristle from the roast, listening to my mother describe me as someone who didn't need anything, while my bank account was being bled dry to fund my brother's struggles. I started to believe my only value was my utility. I stopped buying new scrubs. I wore shoes until the soles were as thin as paper. I became a ghost in my own life, serving a family that treated my presence like the plumbing, unnoticed until it stopped working. There is a philosophy I once read. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. I wish I had understood that at 22. Instead, I kept adding wood to the furnace of my own resentment, pretending it was the warmth of a good heart. The realization of how deep the hole was finally came at my nursing pinning ceremony. It's a major milestone for any nurse, the moment you transition from student to professional. I had bought a small bouquet of grocery store carnations for myself and tucked them into the empty seat beside me. I kept checking the back of the auditorium. Leona never came. I sat there, surrounded by families with balloons and cameras and fathers crying with pride, and I was alone. When I checked my phone after the ceremony, there was a single text from her. Cyprian's truck broke down on the I-55. He was so upset I had to stay and calm him down. You know how he gets. Congrats, Vesper. You're so strong. I knew you'd be fine without me there. I stood in the parking lot of the community college, clutching my carnations and my new nursing pin. The wind was whipping across the asphalt. I felt an emptiness in my chest that, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fill. I realized that if I stopped providing, if I stopped fixing, and if I stopped paying the bills for a brother who was 30 and still finding himself, there would be no one left at my table. I was the safety net, but I had spent so much time looking down to make sure they didn't fall that I hadn't realized there was no one holding the corners for me. I got into my car, the one with the balding tires and the cracked windshield, and I sat in the silence. I didn't start the engine. I just stared at the dashboard. If I stopped today, I wondered, would they even know I was gone? Or would they just notice that the lights went out? It was a quiet thought. Not a decision. Not yet. But the air in St. Louis that night seemed a little colder, and the smell of yeast and burnt sugar from the bakery no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a prison. The air in South City changed on November 14th. It wasn't just the temperature, though the forecast had plummeted to 26 degrees. It was the weight of the silence in our house on Potomac Street. That night, I realized that loyalty is worthless when the person you're loyal to is looking for a scapegoat. I was in my room, packing my old Columbia backpack. It was a sturdy, forest green thing with salt-crusted zippers from years of St. Louis winters. This bag was my bridge. In 2 days, I was supposed to start a high-stakes nursing internship at a hospital in Chicago, a position I'd earned through 4 years of silent, grinding labor. I was methodical. I folded my scrubs into tight, professional squares. I packed my stethoscope, my nursing shears, and my grandmother's old anatomy atlas. I was packing my future, one zipper at a time. Cyprian leaned against my doorframe. He was sweating despite the cold draft from the window. His eyes were darting toward the hallway, a nervous tick he got when the gambling debts were catching up to him. He'd been unusually supportive all day, offering to help me carry boxes, even though I had very little to take. "You really going then?" he asked. His voice was thin, reeking of cheap coffee and desperation. "I'm going," I said, not looking up. I was focused on the teeth of the zipper. "Mom's gonna miss having you around to pay the electric," he muttered. He walked over, picking up a stray hoodie from my bed. "Let me help you with this bottom compartment. You always overstuff it." I felt a slight vibration as he handled the bag, a subtle metallic slide I didn't recognize, but I dismissed it. I was tired. I was 19, and I was so close to the exit that I had stopped looking at the shadows. I didn't see him slip Leona's heirloom diamond ring, the only thing of value she owned, into the very bottom of my backpack. I only felt the heavy silence he left in the room when he walked away. 10 minutes later, the peace was shattered. I heard Leona scream from her bedroom, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the house like a saw. I ran to the hallway. She was standing by her jewelry box, her hands shaking, her face a mottled gray. "My ring," she gasped. "My mother's ring. It's gone." The house went into a military-style lockdown. Richard Brennan, my father, wasn't there to judge, so Leona stepped into the role. Cyprian appeared behind her, his face a mask of feigned, shaky concern. "Mom, calm down," Cyprian said, his voice dropping into that sensitive register he used to manipulate her. "Vesper was just in the hallway, and she's leaving. Maybe we should just check the bags, just to be sure. You know how stressed she's been about money for Chicago." The logic was as crooked as a St. Louis alleyway, but Leona didn't hesitate. She didn't look at Cyprian's sweating forehead or his darting eyes. She looked at me. For 19 years I had been her rock, her utility, the one who fixed her world. But in that moment, she didn't see a daughter. She saw a solution to her son's discomfort. She pushed past me into my room. She grabbed the Columbia backpack, the one I had packed with my future, and dumped it onto the hardwood floor. My scrubs fell out. My stethoscope hit the floor with a dull thud. And then, with a tiny mocking clink, the diamond ring rolled across the floorboards and came to a stop at Leona's feet. The silence that followed was absolute. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at the ring, then at Cyprian. He was looking at the floor, his jaw tight. He wouldn't meet my eye. Leona didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't ask if I'd seen it. She didn't give me the benefit of the doubt she had given Cyprian for 1,000 DUIs and broken promises. She simply stepped forward and tapped me. The heat of her palm against my cheek was a sudden stinging fire. It wasn't a slap born of heat or rage. It was a slap of total cold conviction. My head snapped to the side. I felt my pulse in the teeth on the left side of my face. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my hand to the mark. I just stood there, staring at the forest green fabric of my bag. "I knew it," Leona whispered. Her voice was a razor. "You've been stealing our peace for years with your silence, Vesper. Always so perfect, always looking down on us. Now you're stealing our history. You think you're better than us? You think you can take what's mine to build your little life in Chicago?" "Mom, I didn't—" "Get out." She cut me off. She didn't raise her voice. She pointed toward the door. "I don't care where you go. I don't care if you freeze. You are no longer part of this house. You are a thief in my home, and I will not sleep with a thief under my roof." I looked at her. I looked for the woman who had let me pay her bills. I looked for the mother who had told me I was her rock only weeks before. She wasn't there. There was only a woman who had decided that believing a lie was easier than admitting she had raised a predator and sacrificed a protector. I didn't beg. I didn't Tong Min. To beg would be to acknowledge that their version of reality had merit. I knelt on the floor, my hands steady, and began putting my scrubs back into the bag. I packed the atlas. I packed the stethoscope. My movements were clinical, the movements of a nurse treating a wound that had already gone gangrenous. I zipped the bag shut. The metallic slide of the zipper was the final punctuation mark on my childhood. I walked to the front door. The Missouri winter hit me before I even stepped onto the porch. 26 degrees. I didn't have a coat. It was still in the hall closet, and Leona was standing in front of it like a sentry. I walked out in my thin nursing school hoodie. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing. Then, the rhythmic clack-clack of the deadbolt sliding into place. It was a sound I would hear in my dreams for years. I stood on the curb of Potomac Street. I looked up at the second-floor window. The light was on in my old room. I could see Cyprian's silhouette. He was standing there, watching me. He didn't look guilty. He looked relieved. He had survived another debt, and I was the currency he had used to pay it. I adjusted the straps of the Columbia backpack. It was heavy, but as I started walking toward the bus station, I realized something. My weight is completely different. It didn't contain my mother's expectations. It didn't contain my brother's failures. It only contained my things. My feet were already starting to go numb in my thin sneakers, and the wind was biting through my hoodie, but I didn't turn back. I realized that Leona hadn't believed the lie because it was convincing. She believed it because she wanted to. She wanted me to be the villain so she could stop feeling guilty for how much she had taken from me. I walked 3 miles to the Greyhound station. Every step was a severance. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like an explorer who had just watched their ship burn in the harbor. There was no going back. There was only the road ahead, and the silence I would use to build a wall they would never be able to climb. Rebuilding a life from zero is not a cinematic event. It is a series of quiet, expensive, and mundane transactions. The first snowfall in Chicago, my world was reduced to the 4 walls of a studio apartment in a neighborhood where nobody knew my name. I lived on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of old brick and damp laundry. I had 1 plate, 1 fork, and 1 set of bedsheets that I washed every Sunday at the laundromat across the street. The shock of the eviction had settled into a steady, rhythmic calm. My hands no longer shook when I zipped my jacket. My breathing had leveled out. I spent my days working double shifts as a nursing assistant. Low-level work that paid for my rent and my textbooks. I didn't call home. I didn't check the mailbox for letters that would never arrive. I had realized very quickly that the silence from Potomac Street wasn't an accident. It was a choice. A few weeks after I arrived, a message appeared on my phone from a distant cousin. "Vesper, I'm so sorry you're struggling. Aunt Leona told us everything. We hope you get the help you need." I sat on my single chair and looked at the screen. The help you need. It was a phrase used for addicts, for people who had lost their way. I realized then that I hadn't just been forgotten. I had been erased. My mother hadn't told the family that she had thrown her 19-year-old daughter into a 26-degree night for a crime she didn't commit. She had told them I had spiraled. She had turned my survival into a tragedy she could mourn at her Sunday dinners. She had made herself the victim of a daughter she claimed was a thief. I didn't type a rebuttal. I didn't call Aunt Margaret to explain. If I died that night in Chicago, the news would reach St. Louis, and they would probably hold a small, somber service where they would talk about my potential and how unfortunate it was that I had chosen the streets. They would go to a concert afterward. Life would continue for them without a single ripple. That realization should have hurt. Instead, it felt like a diagnosis. Cold, logical, correct. 1 month into my new life, I took a midnight Greyhound back to St. Louis. I didn't go to see my mother. I went to the curb of Potomac Street. It was a Tuesday. Trash day. The brick houses were silhouettes under the flickering yellow streetlights. I saw a box of my discarded things sitting by the curb, damp from the afternoon rain. Things Leona didn't think were worth keeping. Old school notebooks, a pair of worn-out sneakers, a stack of mail. I knelt on the wet pavement. I wasn't looking for sentiment. I was looking for my tax documents. But as I shifted a pile of damp cardboard, a small crumpled piece of paper caught my eye. It was a pawnshop receipt from a place on Gravois Road, tucked inside a discarded envelope addressed to Cyprian. The item, 1 heirloom diamond ring. The name, Cyprian Bennett. The date, November 12th. I sat back on my heels. My breath was a white mist in the air. I had been kicked out on November 14th. Cyprian had pawned the ring 2 days before he hid it in my bag. He hadn't found the ring in my backpack. He had already spent the money. He had watched our mother hit me, watched me walk into the cold, and watched her bolt the door, all while knowing the ring was already sitting in a glass case 10 miles away. I looked up at the warm, glowing window of my old room. I could hear the muffled audio of a late-night talk show. They were inside. They were warm. They were satisfied with their version of the truth. I could have held that slip of paper to the glass and screamed. I didn't. I realized that if you want to win a war of narratives, you don't fight with feelings. You fight with records. People forget tears. People forget slaps. But they find it very hard to forget a date-stamped document. I stood up, folded the pawn slip, and tucked it into the inner pocket of my Columbia backpack. I walked back to the Greyhound station. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had what I came for. The next morning, I went to a Staples in downtown Chicago. I paid $3 to have the pawn slip laminated. I watched the machine draw the paper through the heat, sealing it in thick, clear plastic. It was no longer a piece of trash. It was a primary source. I went to a bookstore and bought a black moleskin ledger. It had thick, cream-colored pages and a sturdy elastic band. I sat in a coffee shop and began to write. I didn't write about how I felt. I didn't write about the sting of the slap or the cold of the bus station. I wrote facts. November 12th, Cyprian Pawn's ring at Gravois Pawn. Receipt hash 4492. November 14th, evicted. Temp 26. F. Cash on hand, $42. December 5th, Leona initiates addiction narrative to family. I stopped being a daughter that day. I became an auditor of my own history. I realized that love without truth is just a transaction I could no longer afford. I decided that from that moment on, I would move in silence. I would work. I would study. I would build a life so solid and so undeniable that their lies would eventually have nowhere to hide. I didn't send a message. I didn't seek justice from people who weren't capable of giving it. I simply began to record. Power is not a loud thing. Real power is clinical. It is the ability to sit in a room with a person who has destroyed your reputation and feel absolutely nothing because you have the data and they only have a story. For the past 2 years, I've been living in St. Louis and operating as a ghost. My family still thinks I am struggling in Chicago, a cautionary tale whispered over Thanksgiving leftovers. In reality, I am the charge nurse of the night shift at a hospital 10 miles from their front door. I believe in the permanence of ink and the cold finality of a balance sheet. My life is quiet. I live in an apartment that smells of lemon wax and fresh air. Every Tuesday evening, my audit night, I sit at my desk and organize my black accordion folder. There is no anger in this process. I view it as a professional necessity, like checking a patient's vitals before a surgery. I am auditing a failed account. The physical reality of the evidence is grounding. The thunk of my heavy filing drawer, the sharp scent of fresh laser jet toner, and the rhythmic clicking of my encrypted hard drive are my anchors. Inside that folder, I have every bank statement from 7 years ago, every $5 bill from the bakery that went towards Cyprian's DUI fines. I have the laminated pawn slip from Gravois Road. I have the metadata from the social media posts Leona made, the ones where she announced my spiral to the world. I don't look at these to hurt. I look at them to remember that I am the only one who possesses the true record. In this room, quiet is power, Dr. Alaric once told me. Alaric is the attending physician in my ER, a man with a gravelly voice and a posture that suggests he has seen every way a human body can break. He found me 5 years ago, back when I was a night shift scrub in Chicago, sleeping in the hospital supply closet because I couldn't afford a hotel between double shifts. He didn't offer me pity. He offered me a path. He watched me handle a code blue, a chaotic, bloody resuscitation, with a level of detachment and precision that most doctors don't achieve until 50. He sat me down afterward in the break room, the scent of hospital-grade floor wax thick in the air. "They think you're nothing because you're quiet, Vesper," he said, staring at me over his wire-rimmed glasses. "But in medicine, the loudest person in the room is usually the one making the mistake. Keep your records. You have a right to the space you occupy. Don't let them rewrite your history just because you aren't shouting back." He became the mentor I needed, the professional anchor that my family could never be. He taught me that merit is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. He is the person who will eventually verify my character, not because he loves me like a father, but because he respects me as a colleague. That is a far more stable foundation. For 2 years, I have watched my family from the shadows. I haven't called Leona. I haven't reached out to Cyprian. I know they still think of me as the thief, the girl who ran. They assume my silence is shame. They don't realize that my silence is a strategy. Every time Cyprian takes another loan from Leona, every time he misses a payment on his truck and she covers it, the ledger grows. Last week, I received a notification on my phone. A community fundraiser for family values was being held at the St. Louis Botanical Garden, and the Bennett family was listed as a gold-level sponsor. I saw the photo on the event page, Leona and Cyprian, dressed in their best, smiling for a camera that only captures the surface. They looked safe. They looked like a family that had nothing to hide. I didn't feel the old sting in my sternum. I didn't feel the need to call and scream that the gold-level sponsorship was paid for with the money they stole from my future. Instead, I stood at the nursing station, adjusted my St. Louis Hospital ID badge, and checked the IV drip for a patient in Bay 4. I am the Iron Lady of the ER. I have my own name, my own title, and my own keys. As the shift ended and the blue-gray light of dawn hit the hospital parking lot, I walked to my car. I felt the weight of my evidence folder in my work bag. I thought about the event at the botanical garden. I wasn't going to crash it. I wasn't going to make a scene. I simply realized that I was no longer waiting for them to recognize me. I was waiting for the moment the room went quiet enough for the truth to be the only thing left to hear. I went home, took off my scrubs, and sat at my kitchen table. I opened the black ledger and made one final entry. Then I closed the folder and placed it on the table. Everything was ready, though nobody knew. The air in Trauma Bay 1 was thick with the scent of Leona's heavy floral perfume, the kind she always wore to church or social events to announce her presence before she even spoke. It clattered against the clinical ozone scent of the ER, a frantic intrusion into a world that usually only hummed with sterile precision. I stood at the central monitoring station, the glare of the fluorescent lights reflecting off my plastic charge nurse ID badge. I am Vesper, and for 7 years I have been a ghost to the people currently vibrating with entitlement on the other side of the glass. The double doors of the ambulance bay swung open with a hydraulic hiss. Leona burst through them before the security guard could even check her credentials. Her face was a mask of practiced tragedy, the kind of expression she wore back on Potomac Street when she told the neighbors how much she had sacrificed for her wayward daughter. When her eyes landed on me, I saw the split second of cognitive dissonance. In her mind, I was still the 19-year-old girl in the thin hoodie, standing in the rain. But the woman standing before her was wearing the white scrub jacket of a hospital authority. She rushed toward the bed where Cyprian lay, his vitals stable but his face a patchwork of road rash and dried blood. As she reached the foot of his gurney, she began to bark orders. "Vesper, why is he just sitting here? Why isn't a doctor in here yet? He's in pain. Do you hear me? You need to call the head of surgery immediately. Tell them who he is." I didn't look up from my tablet. I was charting the stranger in Bay 2, a 60-year-old man who had been waiting for a CT scan because his oxygen levels were dipping. My neck muscles were tight, but my hands were steady. I raised one hand, palm out, without breaking my focus on the screen. "Stop!" I said. My voice was a low, even frequency that cut through her panic. "You are behind the yellow line, Leona. In this trauma bay, you are a visitor. I am the charge nurse. If you cross that line without my permission, I will have security escort you back to the waiting room." She froze. The mother mask slipped, revealing the confusion of a woman who had lost her remote control. "Vesper, don't you dare use that tone with me. This is your brother. He is the only hope of this family, and you're treating him like a stranger." "He is a patient," I replied, finally looking at her. My pulse was a rhythmic 60 beats per minute. And in this room, patients are treated based on the triage list, not their birthmark. "He's in pain," she hissed, leaning over the gurney rail. The heart monitor gave a sharp thump-thump as Cyprian shifted. "Push that man in the next bay back. He's just some old man. Cyprian has his whole life ahead of him." "You have the power to do this, Vesper. Use it for your family for once." I looked past her at the man in Bay 2. He was a retired teacher, a man who had likely spent 40 years being a rock for people who weren't his blood. Then I looked at Leona. The hypocrisy was so dense it felt physical. "I was family 7 years ago," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet loud enough to reach the ears of Dr. Alaric, who was standing by the medicine cabinet, watching us with a silent, judicial gaze. "And you chose a stolen ring over my life. Here I choose the triage list. He waits his turn." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic whoosh of the air filtration system. Leona's hands gripped her designer purse until her knuckles went white. She was realizing that her authority hadn't just been challenged. It had been revoked. At that moment, Cyprian's monitor gave a sudden, sharp chirp. He was waking up. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open as he took in the harsh white lights of the bay. When his gaze settled on me, his first instinct wasn't gratitude. It wasn't even shock. It was a reflex. "Mom," he rasped, his voice thick with the remnants of the bourbon he'd been drinking before the crash. She's doing it again. She's neglecting me. She's letting me sit here because of the old drama. Tell the doctor. She's trying to hurt me." He looked at Dr. Alaric, who had stepped closer to the bed. Cyprian's eyes filled with crocodile tears, the same ones he had used to convince Leona that I was the thief 7 years ago. "She's always been like this, bitter, jealous. She's purposely kapku-cham to get back at us." I didn't argue. I didn't defend my professional ethics. To defend myself would be to acknowledge that his lie had gravity. Instead, I reached for the iPad docked at the nursing station. I swiped the screen, the blue-white light reflecting in my eyes, and pulled up the folder labeled Audit. I turned the screen toward Leona. I didn't say a word. On the screen was an email. It was dated November 12th, 2013, 2 days before I was thrown into the rain. It was a message Cyprian had sent to a friend named Megan, a message I had recovered from a discarded hard drive years ago. LOL, I moved my stuff to Vesper's desk just in time. Mom's about to lose it over that ring, but she'll never suspect the perfect daughter. She's too busy being the rock to realize the rock is about to get thrown out. Easiest $1,200 I ever made. Below it was a high-resolution scan of the pawnshop receipt from Gravois Road. The signature was unmistakable. Cyprian Bennett. Leona leaned in. Her eyes scanned the text. The floral scent of her perfume seemed to sour in the air. She read the date. She read the name. She read the LOL. "He pawns the ring on the 12th, I said, my voice clinical, as if I were reciting a lab result. "You tapped me and bolted the door on the 14th. He didn't find it in my bag, Leona. He put it there after the money was already spent." The silence in the trauma bay became a vacuum. The hospital staff, the residents, the orderlies, even Dr. Alaric, seemed to step back, leaving Leona and Cyprian on a shrinking island of their own making. Cyprian's monitor alarm dropped to a low, rhythmic thud as his heart rate slowed, not from recovery, but from the sudden, cold realization that his currency was no longer valid. Leona's hands began to tremble. She looked at Cyprian, then at the iPad, then back at me. The 7-year-old lie she had built her life around, the narrative that I was the thief, and he was the hope, didn't just break. It evaporated. "I didn't come here to embarrass you," I said, looking Leona directly in the eye. "I didn't even come here to get an apology. I just stopped participating in the lie. I have a shift to finish. There are people in this ER who actually deserve my time." I didn't wait for her to cry. I didn't wait for her to offer a frantic, hollow, "I'm sorry." I simply turned my back. I walked to Bay 2 and adjusted the drip on the elderly teacher's IV bag. I checked his oxygen levels. I performed my duty. I felt the weight of the room shift. The power hadn't moved to me. It had simply returned to the truth. Behind me, I heard the sound of Leona's purse hitting the floor, and the quiet, jagged sound of a woman finally realizing she had sacrificed her only daughter for a ghost. As I walked toward the break room to grab a new pair of gloves, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I had won. I just felt light. For the first time in 7 years, I wasn't carrying their story. I was only carrying my own. The truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to wait for the room to go quiet. And in the St. Louis ER that night, the silence was deafening. The aftermath of a storm isn't the thunder. It's the ringing silence that follows. After the iPad screen went dark and the digital ghost of Cyprian's 7-year-old betrayal was left hanging in the air of the ER, the atmosphere in Trauma Bay 1 didn't explode. It simply turned cold. The bustling sounds of the hospital, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the distant hum of a floor waxer, the muffled announcements over the PA, all seemed to recede into a dull, low-frequency buzz. The space around Cyprian's gurney became a vacuum. The medical residents and orderlies who had been hovering moved away with efficient, downward glances, suddenly very busy with clipboards and IV stands. They weren't judging me. They were witnessing a structural collapse. Leona stood perfectly still. Her hands, usually so expressive and demanding, were buried deep in the pockets of her coat. She looked at Cyprian, who had closed his eyes again, feigning a sudden lapse into unconsciousness to avoid the glare of the evidence. Then she looked at me. There was no Iron Lady in her eyes now. Only the hollowed-out expression of a person whose primary currency has just been declared counterfeit. "Is he stable?" she asked. Her voice was thin, a dry rattle in the back of her throat. "He's stable," I said. I didn't move toward her. I stayed behind the nursing station, the barrier of my desk between us. But he needs a specific recovery authorization for the long-term neuromonitoring. As the charge nurse on duty, I'm the one who signs off on the protocol before he moves to the ICU. Leona leaned against the gurney rail, her designer purse sliding to the floor. "Then sign it, Vesper, please. Let's get him through this. We can talk about the rest later." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my personal phone. I placed it on the metal tray of the station with a soft, clinical click. "We won't be talking later, Leona. We are talking now, and we aren't talking to me. We're talking to the people you used that lie on." I hit a contact on my screen and turned on the speakerphone. I also hit the record button on my tablet. "Gladys?" I said when the line picked up. Aunt Gladys, the matriarch of the family, the woman who had helped Leona circulate the addict narrative 7 years ago, answered with a confused, "Hello?" "It's Vesper. I'm at the hospital with Mom and Cyprian. Mom has something she needs to tell you and the rest of the elders. She's on speaker." I looked at Leona. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The medical authorization form was sitting right next to the phone. It was a transaction, not an apology. An apology is a feeling, and feelings can be faked. I wanted restitution. I wanted the record corrected in the ears of the people who had erased me. Leona's breath hitched. She looked at the phone as if it were a predator, but she looked at Cyprian's bruised face, and the desperate, blind favoritism that had guided her for 30 years took over one last time. "Gladys," Leona whispered, her voice shaking. I need to set the record straight. About the ring. 7 years ago. It wasn't Vesper. It was never Vesper. Cyprian, he pawned it. I've seen the receipt. I knew back then, and I let her go anyway. I told you all those stories because I didn't want to admit what he was. I lied. She's the one who's been saving us all along." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, followed by a sharp, audible gasp from Aunt Gladys. It was the sound of a family's foundation cracking. "You lied, Leona?" Gladys's voice was cold, stripped of its usual warmth. "For 7 years. We treated that girl like she was dead because of you." I didn't stay to hear the rest. I hit the stop button on the recording, signed the medical authorization with a steady hand, and handed the clipboard to a waiting orderly. "Move him to ICU," I said. I turned to Leona. She was staring at the phone, tears finally tracking through her heavy makeup, leaving gray streaks on her cheeks. She looked at me, her mouth opening to say something. Probably another plea, it was for the best, but I simply raised my hand. "The record is straight, Leona," I said. "Go home, you're done here." I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Dr. Alaric. He didn't say, "Good job." He didn't offer a platitude about family. He just stood there, a professional witness to the closing of a 7-year-old account. "Go home, Vesper," he said quietly. "Your shift is covered. You're done here." I walked out of the ER. The cool night air of St. Louis hit me like a splash of water. I walked to my car, my feet heavy, the silence of the parking lot feeling like a physical weight. As I sat in the driver's seat, my phone began to buzz. A notification from Aunt Gladys, then Aunt Margaret, then a cousin I hadn't seen since I was 18. "Vesper, I'm so sorry. We didn't know. Please call us." I watched the notifications slide across the screen like debris in a flood. I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I had won. I felt a strange, hollowed-out peace, the kind of feeling you get when you've finally finished cleaning up a room where something has been rotting for years. The air is better, but the smell of the rot still clings to your clothes. I was halfway home when a final text appeared from Leona. Are you happy now? You've shamed me in front of everyone. You've destroyed this family just to prove a point. You are always so selfish, Vesper. Even when you're helping, you're just looking for a way to be superior. I read the words at a red light. I didn't feel the old burn in my chest. I realized then that she still hadn't asked. Not once. She hadn't asked how I had survived that first year in Chicago. She hadn't asked how many double shifts I'd worked to pay for the degree she ignored. She hadn't asked about the night I spent in 26-degree weather. Her only concern was her own lost reputation. Someone once said that family is the only group that expects you to bleed for them but won't offer a bandage when you're the one wounded. I didn't block her number. I didn't reply with a clever line. I simply muted the conversation. I pulled into my parking spot at my apartment. The building was quiet. The yellow streetlights cast long, steady shadows across the brickwork. I walked upstairs, unlocked my door, and stepped into my home. It was clean. It was mine. It smelled of lemon wax and fresh air. I sat on the sofa in the darkness. I didn't turn on the lights. Traffic tickets, pawnshop receipts, digital archives, they were just data now. They were no longer a burden. I realized that a family is not a blood bond. It is a ledger of choices. 8 weeks have passed since the night the sirens brought my past onto a gurney in Trauma Bay 1. In the world of medicine, we talk about the golden hour, that critical window where a life can be saved or lost. I've realized that in the world of the living, there is a similar window for the truth. If it stays buried too long, it doesn't just decay, it poisons the soil. But once it's out, the atmosphere changes permanently. The chaos of that night has settled into a quiet, rhythmic equilibrium. My life in St. Louis has returned to its steady, clinical pace. The morning air in Missouri is crisp now, carrying the scent of turning leaves and damp earth. I sit in my kitchen as the sun begins to clear the horizon, watching the steam rise from my ceramic mug in steady, translucent ribbons. I listen to the sound of a key turning in my front door lock. A lock that belongs only to me. There is a profound, grounding peace in knowing that no one in this building has the power to tell me I don't belong here. My phone sits on the counter, its screen dark. It is no longer a source of low-level anxiety. The calls from the family have tapered off into occasional, tentative texts. Aunt Gladys sends a recipe. A cousin asks for a medical recommendation. I view these messages like static on a long-distance radio. Present, but no longer part of the music I'm playing. Cyprian is in a long-term rehabilitation facility, facing a slow recovery from his physical injuries and the sudden, total loss of his status as the golden son. Leona is living in the house on Potomac Street, dealing with the echoing silence of a confession that cannot be taken back. I realized during these weeks that my obsession with achieving was never about the career itself. It was a plea. I was trying to build a life so undeniable that they would eventually have to see me. But standing in my quiet apartment, I finally understood the core truth. I no longer need their recognition to know who I am. A few days ago, I agreed to meet Leona one last time. We chose a neutral cafe in a part of the city where we had no history. The smell of roasted coffee beans was thick and inviting, a sharp contrast to the sour perfume of the ER. Leona looked smaller than I remembered, aged by the weight of a reality she could no longer Photoshop. She sat with her hands trembling slightly, reaching for a sugar packet she didn't need. "Vesper, honey," she started, her voice searching for the old bridge of mother-daughter intimacy. "Can we just put this behind us? We're family. Life is too short for this kind of distance." I didn't answer right away. I reached down and lifted the old Columbia backpack from the floor, the forest green bag I had been carrying when I walked into the rain at 26 degrees. I placed it on the table between us. It looked out of place in the bright, modern cafe, a relic of a war that had ended 7 years too late. Inside were the laminated pawn slip from Gravois Road and the digital recorder containing the family confession. "I'm not keeping these anymore, Leona," I said. My voice was steady, devoid of the heat she was expecting. "For 7 years, these records were the only thing connecting me to you. They were the proof that I existed when you tried to erase me. But I realized that as long as I carry them, I'm still waiting for you to tell me I'm enough." I pushed the bag across the table. It slid over the polished wood with a soft, final sound. "They're yours to carry now. I've balanced my ledger. I've done my duty as a nurse, and I've done my duty as the person who held the truth while you lived a lie. I'm done being the rock for a house that was built on sand." She asked when I was coming home for Sunday dinner. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a mother I needed to please. I saw a woman who chose comfort over her own child. I realized that home isn't a brick house on Potomac Street. Home is a place where people believe you the first time you speak. I stood up and walked out of the cafe. I didn't wait for the bill, and I didn't look back to see her face. As I drove toward the hospital for my shift, the blue-gray light of dawn hit the windshield, and the St. Louis skyline began to glow in the rearview mirror. I thought about that backpack. I thought about how many people are walking around right now carrying a weight that isn't theirs. A lie told by a brother, a silence kept by a mother, a reputation ruined by someone else's fear. If you are listening to this and you are carrying a burden that was forced onto your shoulders, you have my permission to set it down. It's not because you've stopped caring, but because you realize your shoulders can't bear the weight of other people's lies. Sacrifice is only a virtue when it is mutual. Otherwise, it is just a slow, quiet suicide of the self. I pulled into the hospital parking lot and looked at the morning sun reflecting off the glass of the ER. I checked my watch. 6:42. I am the charge nurse. I am a survivor. I am exactly where I worked to be. I felt the familiar weight of my stethoscope around my neck, but the ghost of the backpack straps was finally gone. I walked through the sliding doors, adjusted my badge, and nodded to the security guard. He smiled and said, "Morning, Vesper." "Morning," I replied.